I'm interested to see what dynamics might be different now that I can see you, because last time I was just trying to make sure I changed my position enough so that it wasn't like I was just frozen for the entire thing, because I thought we were both going to be on screen. But now that we're both on screen, this is ideal, but it might completely change the dynamics. You know, I'm a lot more nervous now. You have a very intimidating sideburns.
Yeah. There. It's intentional.
You said you were going to shave, but you didn't.
Well, this is shaving.
Oh, this is shaving.
That's it.
What did it look like before then? You just shave the top part, right, from the eyelids down. Just this hair here, and the forehead.
And this is all clean and clear, and then this is like little stuff.
Right.
The rest of the face looks just like this part.
Right.
So
right.
Normally,
so you wouldn't have to pull it aside when you're trying to make eye contact.
Yeah, or get a drawstring to.
So I'm curious. So as a sort of preface to this conversation, we didn't get into some of the stuff we wanted to, or we could have last time, right? So one of the reasons is because I hadn't seen the Power of Myth series with Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyer. Right.
Yeah.
It's weird to see his how wide his face gets after however many years passed. He has a really square head. It's shocking.
Bill Moyers?
Yeah. Bill Moyers. Yeah. Did I say Moyer?
Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah. And he calls him Joe Campbell sometimes, but I always wondered in the back of my mind, is he okay with that?
Yeah. No, it's you can read in the books in his autobiography. He goes by Joe, so it's fun. I don't think it was they probably had time to talk.
Can you posthumously offend someone?
I'll let you know when that happens.
Spell Matt with one T. Come out of the grave. So you rewatched the last few episodes, I believe, right?
I only had time to watch. I finished off the 5th, and then in the 6th. So I didn't rewatch 1 through 4. But from what I remember reading, so later in his life, he kind of goes through the same subject matter, almost point by point, over and over and over again. So the stuff he spoke about, I've seen it dozens of times already, so I feel like it's pretty ingrained. But
so since you've consumed his work in more forms, right? Is there a best format for consuming that content? I mean, does the TV series do the book justice and vice versa? I found, for example, that I read the Cosmos book after I had seen Carl Sagan's Cosmos series I've probably seen it 5 times, and then I read the book, and the book was terrible compared to, and it's just because the way that they made that series is really kind of transcendent. The way that it's directed, the music selection, it all culminates into this sort of almost surreal, transcendent, philosophical statement on where we are in science at the moment, and maybe where we're going, and maybe where we shouldn't go, and what we should be afraid of. So that is the perfect format for that content. Having only seen the TV series, the interviews with Bill Moyers, and I wonder if that's the best way to consume it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like. So I read the book too, and I think the book maybe it's just basically a transcription of the series. And I haven't done a side-by-side comparison, but because I read the book a month or 2 ago, and then I saw the series, but I think there may have been a little bit more, maybe another question or two in the book. I mean, I'm sure anybody could look it up and see what the difference is, but I guess it's cool to listen to him talk, because he's and maybe that's what would make the video series better, because you do get that dynamic of hearing him speak and his body language and the interaction with Bill Moyers, and then some of the visuals. I mean, they've got those animatics, kind of like Reading Rainbow stuff going on. So
Pretty weak sauce, but
Yeah.
it doesn't add anything for me having that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I prefer to read. I like to read because I can go. There's a different experience for me there. So
Yeah.
since the video and the book are the exact same words, pretty much, I'd probably prefer to read it. But I mean, there's dozens of hours of his talks on Spotify available, and it's just cool to listen to him talk because the way he doesn't use notes in front of an audience, and in his lectures he just goes he doesn't really ramble. He's got a loose idea of the things he wants to go through. I don't know. It's a joy to hear the guy speak.
Some people are like that. Some people just have a way of speaking, and he seems so at ease with what he wants to say that it almost feels like, I don't want to say I don't want to say he's making it up, but it feels like it's the first time that it's occurring. He's just throwing something out there. I mean, clearly he's knowledgeable, but it's just his way of presenting what he knows. I mean, it's really the opposite of the sort of intense intellectual style which might wear people out, and it almost makes you feel like, you know, I'd really like to sit down with this guy and just have a relaxing conversation, and I wouldn't feel intimidated.
Yeah, I think so. To speak to that, it seems like, you know, in that video series, he's, I think, 85 or 86 years old at that point in his life.
Yeah.
And he started, you know, studying all that stuff when he was a little kid. You know, he started reading Native American myths and just read through everything in the library about Native Americans when he was a little boy. And then it just never stopped. And so he's been acquainted with all of that material for decades. And then he taught it for decades at Sarah Lawrence. And so it's just, and you can even see it in the books. You know, you might see some The Hero with a Thousand Faces. You know, that was written, I think, in 1949. But then if you read The Masks of God, which were, I think those started a decade or two later, and then the historical atlas of world mythology, that stuff. I mean, he's been dealing with the same content for decades, so he's just an encyclopedia of that singular subject, and he seems to have some kind of core tenets he likes to talk about, and then he's read just an insane amount beyond that, beyond those core tenets, but he can recall so much of it so easily and make it so clear and conversational.
Well, that's kind of the thing that sticks out to me, is that some of the examples that he selected to illustrate specific concepts seemed to be just out of thin air. Like he had no intention of talking about it 5 seconds earlier, and he just pulled one from the shelf, and it was the perfect example. And I think if you've done any sort of presenting, or if you've had to talk about something at length, or even done videos, that's hard to do unless you really, really know the subject, right? You can't BS your way through it. So that's I think that's what I enjoyed most about it. But I want to get into some of the concepts, and the one that I think they ended it well, because they focused on death at the end. He seems to have a pretty relaxed view of what it means to die, and he seems to on one hand accept that as his, maybe as sort of an abstraction of all of the myths, sort of as his own view on it, right? But at the same time, it's hard for me to pin down, is that your real opinion, or are you just talking about what other people have said? I sometimes find that line hard to discover. So what is your take on his take on death?
So in the biography, towards the end of it, towards his death, he was dealing with esophageal cancer, and he was going through laser treatment, all this kind of stuff. So I'm setting up kind of the story. If you listen, or the way his voice sounds in the Bill Moyers stuff versus how it sounds in his lectures, you can tell that something is off, but the vivacity is still there. He's still, this vivacious, gregarious guy. And crap, what was the question?
My question was about death. I was asking about
Yeah.
his perspective on death, because it seems like a relatively healthy perspective, but I was having a hard time figuring out if that's his perspective or if he's trying to, because when you listen to Alan Watts talk about something, you never know if that's his opinion about it or if he's just sort of going on about something because it's what he's on right now. You know what I mean? Some people are able to talk about things, and you want to ask them, is that what you think? Is that what you believe? Or are you just giving me some interesting examples to illustrate this concept? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And the reason I set up that sort of time span between how he sounded in the video series and how he sounds in lectures is that you can see the vitality he has throughout, decades. Again, or you can hear it in his voice. And so it seems like he's had a consistent view, and all the things he's thought and read and sort of figured out in his head and put together seem to have legitimately impacted his life and worldview, so that he consistently sought after and dealt with this one subject matter, and it compelled him in a real way. So it wasn't an act, it wasn't an idea to sell to people, and yeah, he just kept working. He just worked his entire life, and because he loved what he did, and he loved the subject matter. He loved lecturing and talking to people. I mean, he flew all over the country to do that a lot. And I think he did several trips to Europe, leading some groups and all that kind of stuff. I think they talk about that a little bit in the series, but it doesn't seem like a sham. It seems like
I wasn't saying it's a sham. I'm just
okay.
Yeah, I'm not saying what it is. I'm asking for your take on it.
Yeah, and it doesn't. It seems like all of the material he dealt with just gave him the capacity to be consistent and sincere, I guess. So, and he seemed mellowed out when he died. He had come back from, I think, a talk. He'd come back to Hawaii from a talk, I think, in California or something. He was getting some award from some society, and then he went to the hospital or something, but he was back in his home, and his wife was there, and he stood up and he was about to go upstairs to work, and then he fell over, and that was it. So he died standing up and just doing the thing that he loved.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It seems like if we were going to draw anything out of how those myths affected his idea of death, it seems like he didn't think about it too much. He just kept doing what he enjoyed.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that he constantly repeats, almost like a mantra, is to follow your bliss, which is sort of like it's sort of a surfer dude mantra, really.
Yeah, and he's taken some flack and for using that word, and it makes sense that people would get kind of upset with the idea. Oh, follow your bliss. Well, what if you're in a labor camp or something? How do you follow your bliss? And when
that's kind of what I wanted to go toward, because
okay.
I think that concept, which is basically the idea of do whatever makes you happy, do whatever you enjoy, pursue the things that are meaningful to you, and you know what those things are. Well, there are so many people who can't even. I mean, that's really a very first world sort of 5% sort of ambition. So he's really saying that to a very small group of people. Maybe that group expands over time, but when that interview happened, it was definitely a big group of people, especially then, right? So, doesn't really seem like a universal truth. It seems more like a nice idea that I would certainly agree with, but isn't there something more profound as a main mantra or main statement of your philosophy that would apply to more people? Like at the very least something like find truth in whatever you do. Well, if you're living in a third world country and you have to rummage through a garbage heap every day, or you live in a slum or something, at least you can see that, and you can glean something from that and maybe apply it to your situation, something a little bit more universal, even if it's phrasing a little bit more universally phrased. His phrasing, I think, does have some issues with it, and I wonder if that's just how it looks in the 21st century, or if the bliss had a different connotation when he was saying it, or what. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that statement, when put into context of the rest of the stuff he talked about, it makes more sense. It doesn't come across as cliche or sort of human potential movement-y. So, yeah, I mean, I think people, when that line is the thing that it's kind of like anyone. If anything that you or I say out of 2 hours of conversation, somebody might pick up one line and that might click, and that's what they might ruminate over. It happens to anybody in any conversation. And the stumbling block is that, we tend to forget it's couched within a context of hours or years or a body of work. So that would be point number one, that the guy's got a ton more work, and reading that would then sort of temper the sentiment that comes across in that video series.
Yeah.
And as far as how I could defend that, I would say that
Joseph Campbell's Bulldog.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why does it sounds cheesy to me too, and so how do I apply that? If I like the guy so much, what do I do with that phrase? And so, what I do with that phrase is think about his other bits of work, and it's not as loosey goosey. It's definitely built within more of that framework of, like you said, if your life is digging in a trash heap to find food, then what advice do you take? And I think the rest of his work probably builds more of a case, like you said, which it deals more with a complex, not positive and not negative view of Dharma, but this is just how things are. And it doesn't say just work harder and you'll get the house on the hill. It's not, his follow your bliss, that line that he said isn't a prescription to just, hey, work harder and make the right social moves and you'll do this.
It doesn't sound like that. That's not what follow your bliss means, though, right? Follow your bliss means do what makes you happy. There's no injunction to earn money or succeed in a particular sort of way, right?
Yeah. Well, and he would, I think right after he says that, he warns against, when you take the path to make money, well, then you've lost it. And
right.
So many ways. I mean, not that, making money that's such a, that's another thing that has to be put into context of, well, you need it unless you farm, but then, he wouldn't write off the idea of making money, but it's more of the idea of forsaking what you love for the sake of money, I think.
Yeah. My sort of takeaway from that is the thing that is often repeated in lots of different forms. It's just there might be a set path in society that you could sort of, if you just sort of went limp, you could float through the entirety of life, and it just sort of, if the current is going to the right, you're just going to sort of, as a limp body going down a river, just sort of go to the right, and eventually just die and stuff. But he's saying, well, figure out for yourself what gives you a sense of purpose, and do something along those lines, because it will make you happy.
Essentially, yeah. And I mean, you phrased it a hell of a lot better than I have in the past 2 or 3 minutes. So I think then he uses the idea of the Knights of the Round Table, like probably Gawain and Lancelot and all
the
those
Gawain
guys.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, talking about them sort of not falling into the prescriptions. So all those stories came out of a time, I think, 11th, 12th century. And at that time, love was viewed in a specific way, but then all this literature came along and it sort of turned that view on its head and almost sort of gave people permission or an impetus or a catalyst to sort of follow their bliss instead of following what the prescriptions from the Catholic Church were at the time.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know, maybe that's the more universal application of follow your bliss. It's kind of dividing the prescription from the prescription of what you're told to do, dividing it away or divorcing it from, what you as a human being are actually yearning for, and not just defaulting to what you're told to yearn for. And how does that, that shows up, that shows up in different ways. It changes all the time in people's lives. So I don't know, maybe that recommendation of his is more of just stay active, stay engaged, and keep looking for the times when you're being prescribed to do something and not question it. And when you actually take agency and go after something yourself. So
yeah, the Gawain story is an interesting one. It's kind of one of the longer stories, but what would you say is how does that story end? It ends with,
was it the Green Knight?
Yeah, Gawain and the Green Knight.
Okay. Oh yeah. So it's where he goes. The Green Knight comes into the court, makes a challenge, and then Gawain is the only one brave enough to accept the challenge. And then he follows
cut his
through
head
all
off, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, the Green Knight, if anybody will cut my head off, then I'll cut their head off a year later. And nobody's brave enough or foolish enough.
A weird
to take
thing to do, by the way. I want to eventually get on the podcast with the Green Knight and ask him, don't you have anything else to do, man?
I think there's a movie based off of that story, and I'm pretty sure Sean Connery is the Green Knight. So, and then he goes out into the wilderness, and he's on his way to the Green Knight. He stops at that hermit's place, the hunter's place, and the hunter says, "Yeah, stay with me for 3 days, and I'll go out and hunt. You hang out here at the house." And then they have this exchange, and man, how did he tie that into? I can't even remember.
The hunter's wife,
Mm-hmm.
liked to go in. She was all over him, and he refused her.
Yeah.
And it was hard for him because he was attracted to her. I think that's how it goes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's dealing with his the obligation that he's made, and he's sort of following through with his promise, and he's sticking with his word. So it's sort of the conflict between maybe sexual urges and his honor,
right,
to go through with what he said he was going to do. And then he meets the Green Knight, and he doesn't get his head cut off.
He gets a neck.
Yeah, he gets a nick on the neck only. The Green Knight doesn't cut his head off, and then the Green Knight says to him, because he had accepted a gift from the hunter's wife, and that was the only thing that he sort of slipped on. He allowed himself to receive a gift, and I think it was her bra or something, right?
Yeah, and he didn't
the equivalent of a bra. He didn't tell the hunter about it, right? And so that was his only slip up, his only dishonest act, even though it was not that big of a deal. And so then the Green Knight gave him a little love tap with the sword, and that was about it. And so what is the Green Knight? What does the Green Knight then represent in that story?
Man, I don't know I've read it, but what would it be? I guess maybe Dharma, or like the I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
Can you define dharma?
So Dharma to me, it would be duty, the thou shalt or thou shalt not aspect of anything in life. Yeah. And then part of Gawain's story and other things too is that he doesn't really follow the thou shalt or thou shalt not. He kind of follows the middle path.
Yeah. He's
not
chaotic neutral.
Yeah. So he just kind of follows that, and that was part of that. I mean, and that falls into the idea of follow your bliss as well. That, I mean, I think we've kind of circled around it, that you're not following the prescriptions. You know, you're forging your own path. I mean, and another way that, okay, here's one illustration that Campbell gives that might fall into the follow your bliss idea, but he talks about.
Well, I want to sort of close the loop on the Green Knight if we
Sure.
can. Yeah. Would you say, this is my take on it? The nick on the neck is an acknowledgement of the struggle that we all have to sort of not necessarily take the middle path, but just we're constantly pulled by things to the left and to the right. We're pulled by desire. We're pulled by society, and you know, if you just sort of blindly go with whatever it is, then you're going to somehow fall off and lose control of yourself. If you become a total stiff and you only listen, if you're so honorable, then you become a different sort of character. You become almost a caricature of a person, right? And so it's neither thing is good necessarily, because if you're just completely out of control, following your whims, or 100% by the book, stiff, honor is everything, then you're not really acknowledging your humanity. And I think, to me, the tap on the neck is like an acknowledgement of saying, hey, you know, you kind of did it. You're a human, but you know, you didn't completely blow it. You made it here. You did what you said you were going to do. Get out of here.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, I mean, maybe. Yeah.
Probably gave him a little tap on the butt as he left.
Yeah. I like to imagine he did.
Yeah. Give him a little tap on the neck with the sword and a little swat as he went away.
Get out. Yeah.
Get back to the round table, you.
Yeah.
Green Knight's his dad.
Yeah.
That's how that's sort of how I understood it. But anyway, sorry, you were going to go on a point there. So let's go back to that. What were you going to say?
No, well, I mean, bravo for that interpretation. That was, I think I learned something from Luke on that one. Yeah. So one of the things Campbell always mentions with the knights, and then sort of, you know, not being led along to a certain, you know, not being led by others, or not being led by whims and fancies that just arise in you because of other things, because of social dictates or whatever, is in one of the Grail stories. The knights are going to go on they're about to have a feast, but before they can have a feast, they're supposed to have an adventure, and an adventure could be anything. It could anything that would be out. It doesn't have to be, you know, you go slay a troll or a giant or some, you know, magnificent thing like that. It could be that there was a lightning strike outside the window on a tree, and that would be it. I mean, anything from that, or slaying a troll, something big, could be an adventure. And so,
side quest.
Yeah. So I think it's Gawain. He's Lancelot or Gawain. He says, it would be a shame for us to have a feast before having an adventure, and so they all depart the round table. And that's when he says, it would be a shame if we departed to go on to paths that have already been trod. And so they each departed into the darkest part of the forest where nobody had gone before. And so that's the idea of, you take an agency and ownership of yourself and going and doing something new, not relying upon well-worn grooves that have already been done.
It's interesting. It's interesting how that's though reinforced in so many different stories. I mean, a lot of the stories that are celebrated are the stories of the people who departed from the well-worn path. I mean, there's a reason that the reason that in fifth grade that's the poem that everyone reads is because that's something that's being instilled. It's something that's valued, and that's another example. And there are so many other examples as well. And I mentioned last time we talked about I was reading that story on Norse mythology, right? And there's a lot of that too. A lot about when there's a problem, you have to have a creative solution that's never been done before, like the wedding of it's just some weird stuff in there. Like Thor gets married, he has to pretend to be a lady, and he puts on the wedding veil, and then he murders everybody, but murders everybody at the wedding, including his husband. There's a lot of gay stuff in there, and Loki he's a
character.
He's a trickster, but he's also very sexually ambiguous.
Yeah.
Because he is a deer for a while. I think he's a deer. He takes an animal form. And he has children as a female in the animal form.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of that. It's which is interesting because it's sort of it's more, so I don't know, less binary or I don't know what it is about it, but it's interesting how it's very different from a lot of other mythology. But anyway, the point is that sort of thing is enforced, and at the same time, when you look around, it's not at all. Really, I mean, in the mundane, if you do depart from the well-worn path, then that's the what you would expect if you were to compare the story with life. You would expect, okay, I'm going to be rewarded for departing and doing something different. But in fact, you really face a bigger, not only a larger struggle, but people generally think it's very odd
to depart
from the path. In ordinary mundane life, I mean. Yeah.
And there's in movies, in a lot of books and stuff too, there's the idea of the call to adventure, and a way that shows up a lot is for instance, the Princess and the Frog. So the princess is out near a river or something, playing with the ball. She's tossing it up in the air and catching it, and then she drops it and it rolls away into a thicket or off the path, away from what is known. And if she wants to get the ball back, she has to go away from what is known, off the path, into what unknown, retrieve.
It's a pretty small call to adventure.
A
rolling ball. It's good.
Yeah, but the mechanic. And the reason I brought that up is because it's such a simple mechanic to illustrate the idea of merely moving off of what you know. I mean, even, we take a hike in the woods and you see sort of the sort of path that goes off into the brambles, and you might follow it. I mean, it's a similar thing, or taking a different route to work, something like that. I mean, and because it's going away from what is known into what is unknown to bring something back. And it could be as simple as that, or it could be like when you went to Japan first, you just went and showed up. You'd had no set plan. You had no, like you found the job on Google, and then you just showed up. You didn't really have
China. Yeah.
And you didn't. You'd never been there before. You didn't know the language. You didn't know anybody there. You just wanted to go. There was something, compelling you to go, and you went way off the. You didn't go through a program that set it up for you that had all these things figured out. You just kind of went.
Right.
Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So and that's a much grander idea of a call to adventure because and then you go and you have this experience, and now look at what you're doing. You know, you're doing Yoli and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, simple call to adventure, and then larger call to adventure.
Are those somehow combined? I mean, the idea of is straying from the path and the norm somehow connected to, or always necessarily connected to the call to adventure? Does it have to be linked? Does the idea of becoming or following the hero's path have to be into the unknown in some form, or can it be completely? Can it be mundane and have a sort of maybe just be in the subtext or something? You know, I don't know how many forms it can take.
Yeah, so going back to, Campbell used a lot of psychology and biology and anthropology in his books, and so all that's, what do you pull out of the use of all those different things? How do you restate that in one sentence? Well, it seems like what he's pointing to is that's just what the human brain does. The human brain sort of wants to rest within something that's comfortable and known, but it has to go out to the unknown and expand consciousness a little bit, and then bring it back to what is known to sort of just expand its capabilities and capacities. So, and it's a drive. It's something we all innately desire to do. And in order to do that, you have to get out of what is known into the unknown in some capacity to keep sort of motion and movement. And I hesitate to say progress, but going out to bring something back. I mean, you could even look at hunting in a hunter-gatherer culture. You go away from the village out into the unknown, into the forest, to procure meat to bring, or whatever, or gathering fruits and vegetables, whatever, and then bring it back to nourish what is known. And then you just, that just gets bigger and expands and expands. But there's all that underlying mechanic of the known and unknown, no matter how epic or grandiose or mundane they look.
But is it, to what extent is it supposed to be prescriptive as opposed to descriptive? You know what I mean? Because you said It's something that's a part of it's a part of us, right? We don't naturally like to always follow whatever the program is, and we have a tendency to, at least in some capacity, unless you're a total stiff. Everybody has to, in some capacity, probably go off the path. I mean, even if it's not a major departure, right? Maybe that's human nature, as you were saying. I don't know. I think it probably is. So that's descriptive, not prescriptive.
Right. Yeah.
So that goes back to kind of what I was saying before. This is not something I've really thought about that seriously, to be honest. But if it's descriptive, it's acknowledging that it's part of us, but not recommending it.
Yeah.
And we aren't, when we do it, the circles around us often kind of do that and maybe look at us funny, because again, it's not recommended. Mm-hmm. When it happens, you hear about it usually when it's successful. Mm-hmm. And so there's, I don't know exactly what that is, or what, to what extent it's supposed to be prescriptive. I mean, I don't know. It just seems like it's something that is necessary as a thing to acknowledge as a part of ourselves, and the stories are sort of a manifestation of that acknowledgement that we need to do this, and when we do it and succeed, it brings back a much larger reward than if you were to just plod along. However, it's almost like when you're doing it, you deserve the strange looks you get, because it is by nature something that has to be against the natural order of things. Yeah.
Yeah,
Does that make
yeah.
sense?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So you're talking about just the difference between, or where the line is, or the qualifications for being descriptive or prescriptive, and
Because I like to try to do that, because I think, well, if we're talking about, so we started the conversation by talking about the conversation between Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell in this series of interviews.
right.
And
Hey,
so,
shut my door real quick.
okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's all right. I want to leave that part in. I'll put a little music in there.
Elevator music.
Put a little drum track in there. For the 4 seconds you were away.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was I saying? Oh,
you
yeah.
talking.
Yeah. So so when I watch something like that, I'm always trying to figure out: am I watching something interesting, or am I watching something that I can then extract juice from and use in my life? And I always try to figure out what is the juice to extract and what is not. So the follow your bliss stuff is definitely prescriptive, meaning this is a good idea, go for it, right? It's definitely prescriptive. Campbell's view on death, which is basically, don't worry about it too much, is definitely prescriptive, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. Then there's a lot of, I mean, the whether it's The Hero with a Thousand Faces or those two episodes on that topic, it seems to me to be interesting, but I don't see anything there that I can then extract and begin to implement, because it's already part of, in certain aspects, my thought process, as I'm sure it is for most people in some ways, in some parts of their lives, whether it's their work or how they spend their time after work or what they like. I mean, really, as you said, sometimes those departures can be very small, like the ball rolling down through the thicket toward the magical frog.
Yeah. So, I don't know, maybe to provide some context for when he talks about that stuff and why is it interesting and useful. I mean, one thing that might be helpful to think about is when people read the work, read something that he wrote, maybe they're already seeking or sensitive. They're already sensitive to, man, this sucks. I'm bored, but I don't really know what to do. And then when they come to a work like his, it's, and he lays out sort of a narrative form of, here's what you're looking for. Here's some similarities and stories and throughout history
it's been done. Other people have felt this way. Yeah.
Yeah. And think about, how many people don't, and think of that merely just knowing the narrative as a tool. And then think about how many people maybe don't even have that tool. And so when they come to the content, they get a new tool. And, I mean, how many people do you know that kind of are not fed up, but sort of stuck in a rut or a little bit disenchanted or just going through the motions and all those kinds of things? And then, I mean, maybe you don't know anybody like that.
You're literally the only person I know.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, but you spilled the beans, so it's out there now. Think of somebody who just doesn't have that tool yet as how do I get out of this rut? I'm stuck in some routine, but they don't know how to get out of the routine because they just don't know how. So then they find that outlet maybe in somebody like Campbell's work because of all the narratives before, and then versus somebody maybe like you or any of your entrepreneur friends that are a little bit more innately or have that narrative more innately ingrained on their psyche. That's just something that's always been there for them. So it's almost a question, well, who has heard these ideas of breaking out of the mold and sort of going against the grain and feels comfortable with it, and then who has never heard of it and they're sort of stuck in a rut and maybe could benefit from it.
That's interesting. So that's sort of it. That's a third category. There's descriptive, prescriptive, and aspirational.
Okay.
Inspirational. It's inspiration. I mean, I can understand how it'd be inspirational. I get that. I get that. You say, oh, this is a thing that is universal, and I'm living inside of my tiny little bubble, but I'm part of a tapestry of patterns that have been the same throughout the ages, and I see the larger picture a little bit. I'm not just one dude living in this era. I'm one dude who is analogous to another dude who is living 500 years before me in a society that might have been shockingly different, but there were still these core things that are similar. And now I can see myself from that context, and it helps me to maybe view my own potential call to adventure when otherwise it might have just whiffed by me because I was going to work every day and I didn't even know that that was a thing. So it might help people spot their call to adventure. That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, and I mean, in some sense, him making that. I mean, that when somebody comes, let's say, if somebody came to him with that problem, I don't know what I'm doing. I've got. Well, then the prescription is more cowbell. The prescription is more of the narrative.
Yeah.
Exactly what he says, and I think that's the dynamic. There's the description of how humans act, and then there's his prescription for how humans can act, and that sort of falls into that dynamic of, well, when people are looking for this stuff, then they might find it, and so does that make sense?
Yeah. You're still you're still sort of lame though if that's what you need to break out of your habit pattern, because you're basically saying, I just learned about a well-worn path, which is done by many heroes, and that now I get to do another well-worn path. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of joking, but that is, I mean, really, it's safety in numbers. You realize it's a thing that exists that people have done. Whereas if you thought, wait a second, nobody has ever done anything weird and succeeded, or you hadn't really deeply thought about why are there stories about slaying dragons? Why do those exist? Is it just for fun? Of course it's not. It's not just for fun, right? But most people don't just sit there and think of those things by themselves, which is why I think a lot of people are fascinated by that sort of work. And I think at the beginning of that series, the elder Bill Moyers is talking about how so many people have written in and said thank you very much, which was interesting to me. I was expecting all sorts of mind-blowing revelations, and when I went through it, it wasn't what I expected. I thought at every point, whatever I happened to be doing while I was listening to it, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's a good story. That's interesting. But at no point did I think, Jesus, I got to write a letter to somebody. This is changing me. You know what I mean? I never at any point had that feeling. And I'm not trying to make any statement as to why that might be. I'm just saying I think that there are maybe for different people different ways of gleaning value from whatever it is that we consume. And for me, it's not like I knew everything that was there. It's just that maybe a lot of the deeper concepts are kind of part of my personality, and so none of it necessarily shook me at a deep level. You know what I mean? But it's fascinating stories. I love his stories about going to, for example, ring the bells at the at the church. And is it a Jesuit church or what?
I don't know. I think it's just a Catholic.
Yeah, but that really resonated with me, because I go to sit down every time I walk home. I go to sit down in the local Catholic church. I just sit there for 10 minutes, just look around. It's really quiet. It's really quiet.
Yeah.
And then sometimes sniff the incense a little bit and then go.
Yeah.
See if the confessional booth is unlocked.
Yeah. And then what?
It's quarters in there. Laundry. Laundry money.
with a note, please have it by Friday.
I put yeah, no, I drill quarter slots into all the confessional booths, and I put a little receptacle at the other end, because then people think it's pay to play, but nobody
Yeah.
else knows that. And then I sort of sneak in every week and take all the quarters, and then I've got laundry money for the week.
Hey, you pay to play or pay to pray?
Pay pay for my laundry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's content that might be mundane to some, but it might be revelatory to others. I mean, everybody's at a different point, and so
I didn't say mundane. I didn't use that word.
sorry. So
That's
you
okay.
mentioned okay. The
Don't worry about it. It's okay. Don't stress about it.
okay. I'm lost. My comedy sensors aren't working. You know this.
Mine aren't either. Mine aren't either.
Yeah. But that's why it's great. But seriously,
that was funny. That was very funny.
in a sense, everything is mundane. I mean,
Yeah.
and there's nothing that's, and that would be another point that Campbell would put up against the idea of any adventure, any life. I mean, yeah, it's in a certain context, it's incredible, it's fantastic, it's epic. But then in another context, I mean, stars and universes or stars and suns are blowing up all the time. So what is taking a different route to work compared to stars blowing up and all that kind of stuff? So there's yeah, it's all contextual. It's not like there's some the idea moves, right? The importance of the idea fluctuates according to what it's up against, what it's next to. So there could be another person that comes later that's going to blow Campbell out of the water, and maybe yeah, does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. But I mean, what? So I think any great work of not it doesn't have to be in a particular area. I think any great intellectual work
Mm-hmm.
will have value for people on different levels.
Yeah.
So whether it's value for people in confirming their, the way that they already are, or value for people in opening their mind to completely new possibilities that they hadn't considered before, or it just providing, general insights into how people used to think in the case of considering mythology, which is not something that people think about every day. You're providing insights into the software of society in the past, right? If we can use that analogy like we did last time, we focus so much on generally we focus so much when we look into the past on the hardware. We focus on the routines, I guess. We focus on how people live to an extent, but we focus mostly on the relics because we physically have those things. We focus on the objects because those are the things that we can touch and see. And so when someone is able to help us tap into how people experienced spiritually their place in the world, and we can feel like we're being plugged into that, and even if we don't feel the same way, appreciate it, then that is inherently valuable in the same way that studying history is inherently valuable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if I can understand how Native Americans, where their code comes from, right? If I can understand that there are people who saw themselves as completely one with nature on a deep level that Western society can't even come close to, then I can begin to appreciate appreciate my own environment in a slightly different way, and that's beneficial. But I would say the same thing for I mentioned the Carl Sagan Cosmos series several times, but I see it as a kind of similar work because it is the culmination of a person with a very interesting perspective of their, it's sort of their, what do I want to say? What am I looking for? It's their, what is the word?
Yeah.
Magnum opus. Maybe.
Yeah.
Although I wouldn't say that, not necessarily Joseph Campbell's main work, but for sure, culmination of their work. Okay, whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not finding the proper word, perhaps, but like that Cosmos series is transcendent for me. Even though I know all of the facts and I could have read them separately, but it provides me a sort of more profound understanding of my place in the world, and I actually have got things from that I didn't have before.
Mm-hmm.
And it has had a really large effect on me.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of a new way of looking at, we were talking about in the last one, and I definitely don't want to get hung up on that again, but we were talking about in the last conversation about what is the new what is the new code that we have that helps us orient ourselves in society, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's possible that showing people perspectives that make other behaviors negative actions almost unimaginable, showing people the correct perspectives, giving people the right information so that they can't imagine maybe harming the environment. That is in itself, I think, part of what we were talking about what is it that we have, what sort of code do we use to orient ourselves. Just looking at a picture of Earth, just looking at a picture of the entire planet as it is, without borders, makes you realize, oh yeah, someday we're probably going to have a world government. That's probably going to happen. And then you start thinking in that way a little bit, at least thinking it might be inevitable. Or you realize that the planet Venus has a runaway greenhouse effect that has made it basically an acid rain, completely inhospitable pizza oven type planet, the entire thing, and you would just immediately fry if you went there. And the reason is because you have a greenhouse effect. Then you start thinking, well, that is the same thing as global warming on a ridiculous scale. So it's a real thing, and it has fried a planet, and something to be careful about, something to consider. And it helps keep that in mind in a real and tactile way. And so that is the kind of thing that orients me, just seeing something in a way that I haven't seen it before. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, what am I trying to say? That I think that opening new perspectives for people is a great way to go forward. And I think great thinkers like Carl Sagan and Joseph Campbell are the value they add. I think the main value they add is they can open doors of perspective that maybe people don't normally have, and they can only see it because they're so far into their perspective fields that it's like, and then they show it to you in a way that you can understand instead of a very intellectual way.
Yeah. So what's your problem with the power of myth? Because everything you just said, that was kind of a joke, but yeah, I mean, you nailed it. That's exactly what I would say about Campbell or the power of myth and that kind of stuff. That the value lies in just showing something new. Like you're never gonna, when you're a kid and you believe in Santa Claus, you orient your life around that story of Santa Claus. But then somebody comes and tells you and gives you a new perspective on Santa Claus, and then you don't believe in Santa Claus ever again, and you never will. And the consequent actions in your life change according to that new perspective, that new knowledge you got. So, like you pull, or you get a lot out of Sagan because it speaks to you. Your makeup is receptive to that, and it's effective to your makeup. The way he lays things out and all that kind of stuff. But This similar thing seems possible with Campbell's work. Some people are looking for that type of thing, and they're sensitive and receptive to it, and it has a huge impact because of that. Whereas for somebody else who just thinks differently, they may not get as much out of it.
Right.
And the same thing with Sagan and Cosmos. It's an incredible work. It's an incredible feat, but maybe somebody's not ready for it, or maybe they're not.
Or maybe they're way above it.
Yeah, so maybe it seems mundane to them that, like, yeah, God, of course I know this stuff.
Right.
Give them a tap button, go home, Sagan.
That's the phrase of the day. That's give them a tap and send them home. But what orients you in your life? What do you have? Guideposts? Do you have things that allow lenses that you look through that allow you to see the world? Do you have either things that you've experienced or seen or learned that have opened your mind to things that are out there, perspectives that then shape your behavior?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, an easy one to point to is, I grew up in the South, Southern Baptist fundamentalist evangelical.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this quite a bit, but the specific way and place where I was raised, one of the big ideas that was ingrained in me was, the lens that was ingrained into my eye socket was, be afraid of everything that's not Southern Baptist fundamentalist evangelical. And just be afraid of it because the evil is bad. And then how is that, just out of curiosity, how is that lens made clear? I mean, how is that lens presented? So anything that was unrecognizable as what I already knew, then I was afraid of it. It was like, oh, this is a threat. Or if it looked, here's a small example. It was, so secretly as a kid, I loved D&D art. It's kind of dark and gritty and stuff. But then from the way I was raised, it was, oh, that's evil. It's bad because it's gritty and dark. And so then anytime I would see anything that resembled that, kind of like when Rob Zombie or White Zombie was on the scene, or Marilyn Manson came on the scene, it's like, oh, I automatically know that that's bad. I got to stay away from it, and I'm afraid of it. But
were you really afraid of it, or were you afraid of it in spite of you liked it in spite of yourself, or you were genuinely afraid of it, or you were afraid of people finding out that you weren't afraid of it?
I think it may have been afraid of the idea that maybe I secretly liked it, kind of thing. So it was taboo, but you kind of like it, but you got to stay away from it. But that makes it so much more difficult because, thou shalt not part of it makes it that much more attractive. But so you got to fight against it, and just gets in this reciprocal, this reverb, this feedback loop of making a bigger noise of dissonance and confusion in your head. So anyway, but then as growing up and having more influences come into your head and into your experience, that stuff just kind of falls away. And then having the opportunity to travel and, when you see how other people live and it's not what you thought it was, or it's not what you were told, I was told, oh, fear it, because it's not the super religious stuff that's safe and pristine. When you actually get out there and experience it, that's, man, I lost the track again.
Yeah, you were talking about how the lens was given to you. I was asked because I'm interested in I actually like the analogy of lenses, because a lens can be shaped in different ways and colored in different ways, and the shape and the colors of those lenses adjust how you view your reality, and then through that then adjust your behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
And
if your lens is Southern Baptist and that means that anything outside of what you were raised to believe is dangerous, then then the world is basically lava, and you have to tread the path very carefully, right? I know,
Yeah.
and I kind of know what that feels like, but not to that extent, nearly.
Yeah, and so and then getting out and having the option to shop for different lenses, and then you try other ones on. Oh, well, what's the lens of a Belgian? Like, how do they see the world? Or what's the lens of somebody who's just not in the Southeast? Like, what is that? What is the Pacific Northwest lens like? And then you can try them out, and then your own capacity grows, I guess. And that's what happened to me anyway. Just seeing, I don't only see with the lens of a Southern Baptist anymore. I've traded it for, that's a very narrow lens. So I see
can you whip it out every now and again when you need to?
Yeah. On occasion, that's kind of, when you can still sympathize with why somebody feels so fearful, because what it is like, and then that is a great way to potentially build a bridge to sort of reduce or give them the tools that were given to you, so that their consciousness and capacity expands as well, and you're sympathetic to it. So you're not going to say you're not going to just view them as a dumb demon or something. It's going to be, oh yeah, I totally know what that feels like, and how do you feel about this? And
I think that's really important. I think that's really important because, and I think, I guess it's extremely obvious, but the experiences that we have give us the tools to empathize with people who have been where we were. Not necessarily that every place that we were is less advanced. It's just a different place. Yeah. Whereas someone who hasn't been through that has no concept, and so can really otherize that person, and it's very easy to just mock.
Yeah.
Especially in the case of religion,
Yeah, and especially in a case of just religions that are so insular and don't have exposure or contact, and are kept that way. Kept from contact with things that are different and people that are different. And so, yeah,
but it's interesting how that doesn't exist just for religions. It can exist within entire countries. During the Great Leap Forward in China, there was a lot of that going on, where you had little kids doing drills where they would scream about if they had little chants where if the Americans show up, we'll stab them, and that sort of thing. They practice with cute little bayonets, practice little stomach stabs.
Let's make murder.
But that's a lens.
Yeah.
And that particular lens, if we're gonna use your this thing, right? That's a very narrow one, and the only way to keep that narrow, you have to have you can't have a very, very specific worldview like that without enforcing it, because things tend to bleed out and things tend to bleed in.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me how whether it's a specific belief or a specific cultural group or a specific time period in a country's history, it's interesting how it all looks kind of the same. You have to enforce it in similar ways, maybe to lesser or greater degrees. Sometimes you have to kill people, and to a lesser degree, you just have to maybe say if you leave, we'll shun you, something like that, which is less serious, but still one of the things that are used in, say, the Amish tradition, right? I don't know if yours did shunning much, but it's just interesting how that it's the structures are the same, the mechanics are the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Just for the record, though, what were your steps along the path out of your religious belief? I know we've talked about it before, but I'm just want to get it down for the books.
Yeah. So the two things I've always said, it was Reformed theology and psychology. that were the two straws that broke the camel's the back when it came to what, which led to me essentially not going back to church again. And so with Reformed theology, it was the idea that there's the whole idea of predestination and not once saved, always saved, but you're either elect or you're not, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
And so then I thought, well, if that's the and built into that, I think Paul, I forgot, maybe it's in the Romans. He's talking to the verse goes something like, if God finds fault with me, but he made me, well, then I could say to him, well, why have you made me thus? If you've made me this way and you find fault with me, well, how is that fair to me? Why do you punish me for that? And then Paul's response is, how can the clay say to the potter, why have you made me thus? But that seemed like kind of a cop-out answer.
Yeah.
So, and that's, and then the idea of predestination or even non-predestination, either way, God's responsible. Because is this interesting? Should I go forward? I don't want to.
Keep going, please. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So I'm
all about it.
Okay. So it's the idea that let's say predestination is true. Let's take that and say that we accept it. Well, that means that
predestination means the body of Christ and the other, right? Is that what that is?
The elect and the non-elect.
Yeah.
It's saying that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was limited to a specific group of people, and the payment is effective for them, and then only everybody else it's not effective for. Well, in that case, it's God's responsible. The responsibility for who goes to heaven, who goes to hell is on him. It's not on me at all, because that's an omnipotent decision he made a long time ago to say, okay, these people are going, these people are not.
Right.
And that's, there is no sort of free will in that. It's all God's decision before time. So then the Armenian, there's Arminian. I think Joseph Arminius he's sort of the antithesis to the predestination or John Calvinist view. I think it's Joseph or Jacobus Arminius. I forgot, but I think it's Arminius. It's not Armenian because that's the place. It's Armenian. It's the idea that of free will, essentially, that you make a choice to follow or not to follow, and it's because of your choice that you either go to heaven or hell. But even then, we could ask the question, well, if God knows everything that everybody's going to do, then he knows before he even created human beings that some were going to choose to follow and some were going to choose not to follow. And yet he went ahead with the plan. So, and he knew that I was going to murder somebody, or I was going to love somebody, or whatever. Or that, the worst person you can think of was going to exist who commits the most heinous crimes. Yet he persisted in creating.
Then it just seems like the whole thing seems like some sort of God was lonely and wanted to just run out a simulation to watch, just to sort of entertain himself. It does boil down to that. If the determinism thing, the elect and the non-elect, right? Everything is predestination. If predestination is real, then it's all just sort of like king and entertainment happening for the king's pleasure, right?
That's with the predestination idea. Arminian, it's God is still at fault because he knew that people were going to sin, but he created them anyway.
It's to a lesser degree, though, right? Because it's sort of like I've structured the entire universe, but you've got this little bubble around you. And within that little bubble, I have absolutely no ultimate. I know what you're going to do, but I have no ultimate power over that, because that bubble is your free will, and I can't cross through that bubble. I could probably change everything around you and maybe make you do one thing or the other, because I have full omniscience apart from that, but omnipotence apart from that. But that's the thing I can't touch. That's the free will argument, right?
Yeah. Well,
then we can say, well, you decided Yes, you knew, right? But it's like, what would be a good example? I think that people would say, and I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate, I think that people would say the free will situation is not as egomaniacal as the determinism situation because you still have agency in some form. Even if all the circumstances around you force you to choose, you've still made that choice. I think that's how it goes.
Yeah, I mean that sounds like an argument I would hear, and I think what would be, and then the whole idea would be, well, the ideas would hinge upon, well, what do we mean by omnipotence, omniscience, and was omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence? What do we mean by those things when we attribute them to God, and how far do they extend? Are they totally complete and all pervasive, or? And I always just took it that, yeah, they're totally complete and all pervasive, because if they're not, then it seemed to sort of negate the idea of God being trustworthy in the first place, if he's not all of those things, in fact. And so then when I came to that Arminian point of view, it seemed like, well, yet again, God is responsible.
So that was step 2 for you. That was the second. The first?
Well, the first was Reformed theology. And I mentioned the predestination thing and then set it up against the Arminian view. And then the other thing was psychology, which was, I was in psychology class in college, and I was just thinking, if you can alter somebody's behavior or emotions or feelings with pharmaceuticals, well, where's and which is just biology and essentially cause and effect, drugs affecting human behavior and that kind of stuff. Well, where's the room for anything spiritual or anything sort of mysterious? Because we're talking about physics, essentially. In physics, the sort of hypothesis with it is that there is no mystery to it. This is what is.
Right. We don't fully understand it, but there's no reason to suspect that it's anything other than completely biological.
Right. And so that just removed. So, that also married with the logical fault for responsibility for sin and built into Reformed theology and thus Arminian theology. Those two things, I can't go back to church because, that's where the psychological shift came in. Did
it click into place, or was that a very gradual period of time? Was there a moment when it clicked into place for you? Because I'm fascinated by the process.
It was definitely gradual because, it kind of like it was gradual, and Campbell's ideas would be a good illustration of it because, I would essentially, as the foundation started to crumble, I would take little adventures out into the forest where no path had been cut, and I would explore a little bit, and then I'd come back home and reapply the things I learned into my little mental village. And then I'd go out a little bit more and a little bit further in different spots. And it's just learning.
It's a really good analogy for understanding it. I had some of the similar experiences. Watch a YouTube video of someone else's ideas, right?
Yeah.
And say, come back, but come back to it. But then it's not that it's a slippery slope. It's that once you are able to stand up within that new territory, then what you realize is you look back at it and you realize that you have to wear a special pair of glasses that have like lots of little things covering over lots of things in order to. I mean, it's really a mental effort to believe something genuinely, to be, I think, to be religious. I think it's actually taxes people, even if they don't realize it, because if you aren't wearing those glasses and you just look at the world as it actually is, there's really only one conclusion you can draw.
It seems like people, if those are pairs of opposites, that you look at the world and believe in God, or you look at the world and don't believe in God, that there's just, people at every degree between negative one and positive one. They're just, they fall all along those lines.
Yeah.
There's well-regarded physicists that still, they believe in God, they believe in a creator, they believe in, the Christian worldview.
Which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think
the assumptions that you have to make in order to get there.
Yeah, and I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about it on some interview, and he said that, well, in a survey of 100 scientists, something 7 to 17 of them still believed in God. And he said, well, the fact that 83 of them don't believe in God, that's not interesting. It's more interesting that these 17 or 7 to 17 are scientists and they still do. Like, well, how do they do that?
Yeah.
Because it seems so, just like you said, accepted that a scientist isn't going to adhere to a faith or a belief structure that, you describe.
I think part of it, I think a lot of it is that I think we have a natural ability to look at the unresolved versions of things and not dive deeply into them, and sort of that's the engine that drives our cognitive dissonance machines, because I have all sorts of cognitive dissonance, right? And it's hard work to dispel things that just I assume are there or are true without any sort of. I think we have some things that are kind of programmed in that make us give us the tendency to believe things because that was a useful thing to have, or maybe sometimes is a useful thing, because the very fact that we're able to sort of color in the blank spaces with some smudge or whatever it is, so the world looks all in color without really diving into each of those things and analyzing them. That's an interesting thing in itself. But I think that is ultimately what cognitive dissonance is, where you can at the same time, I guess the extreme version of it would be that scientist who studies light that's billions of years old and then at the same time believes that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and that if the universe is 6,000 years old and light is coming from billions of light years away, you can't square those things logically. So you have to use your cognitive dissonance machine to kind of just say, well, but this just, I'm able to produce the results over here, and this is a personal thing, and my whatever it is that allows me to keep this at fuzzy resolution in this context and that at fuzzy resolution in this context, whatever it is that allows me to do that, it helps me keep going, and I feel happy, and that's good enough for that person. As you said, that's one person within that continuum. And it's hard work to sort of try to sit there and just scratch at what something actually is and think through it and explore it. And it's not particularly a fun experience.
Yeah. So I think I've heard Peterson mention it, and I'm pretty sure I've heard Campbell mention it, but either way, they both talk about similar things. It's the idea of there's an illustration, a narrative of exactly what you're talking about, and you can see it in the Bible with the idea of the apocalypse. And the apocalypse means to reveal something, or to be revealed. And so, if and in that story of the apocalypse, eventually you have the old world passing away and a new world coming in to take its place. And so think of kind of, going back to the Santa Claus idea. In that old world where you believe in Santa Claus, everything is, how to act, you know what to do, you've got the tools to maneuver and procure the result that you want, right? But then when you have this new information come in about the reality of Santa Claus, well, then an apocalypse happens, because that old way of doing things, that old world, has to pass away. The old world passes away, the old way you did things, the whole old way of understanding things. And so then a new world comes in based upon that revelation of new understanding. And that's a pretty minorly catastrophic apocalypse, right? But then think about an apocalypse of you have a life-altering accident, somebody, a dramatic story about an athlete who's gets paralyzed, right, from the waist down. I mean, that's in a sense an apocalypse where the whole structure of their life and the way they viewed the future and everything they viewed as useful is all of a sudden, potentially destroyed, and they have to reconstruct everything new. They have to develop a new world, essentially, and a new way to live and a new value system and everything like that. So, we've got a small Santa Claus example, but then we've got the paralysis example, and those are two very different situations that have different levels of anxiety and stress associated with it. And so, when you and I would you consider yourself formerly religious? You were at one point? Or you had a belief system?
I certainly did. But I had the strange feeling that when I crossed the line, and it's kind of a fuzzy line for me as well, I had the feeling like I guess when you learn who your parents are, you think, oh, that there's some sort of closure and completion, a sense of this is who I really am, and then there's something you connect with it, you identify with it, and you realize that that's not necessarily the truth, but at least that represents who you are much better than the previous iteration, right? So it's not that I felt ingenuine before, but when I wasn't religious, it was I felt much more genuinely myself.
It was much more clear and transparent as to reality.
It was very liberating and like, oh, this is who I am. Okay. And it was almost, I almost want to say, oh, I always believed this. I always thought this way. And I finally just realized why. But actually, I do have to say, it's hard to define. It's hard to say whether I was just saying I believed things before or whether I actually did, because that in itself is kind of hard it's a tough line to draw. But I don't know how to say it. More genuine, I guess, after. Okay.
But you would agree that at one point you were under illusions of a religious idea. That was the tool you were using at some point. So
yeah.
And to some degree, you can probably empathize with what it would feel like for somebody who has constructed their life around a religious ideology, and then to challenge that. I mean, that's a big potential apocalypse.
Yeah.
And for them, I mean, it was over the course of years for me. And I would say, even from that point to now, from college to being in Seattle for so long, I mean, even that's been a long course of change. But understanding how cataclysmic that can be does seem to compel and make useful the idea of grace and compassion. So when and understanding how and empathizing with how catastrophic those new ideas can be, it seems like then, well, if I sincerely care about how people view things and would want to convey reality to them, then being patient, being kind, and bringing that essentially new good news with the best intentions would...
You got to be careful with that language, though, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's the most pretentious thing I've ever heard.
The good news? Yeah. No. Well, have you heard about it? I'd like to tell you about it, Luke. That Carl Sagan knows you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Knows you, loves you, and has a wonderful plan for your life. The
great calculator in the sky.
Is it a TI-83?
You know it.
It's got Texas Instruments, yeah. But those big ideas and knowing the weight that they put on people, it seems like, man, if I knew what I went through, and I'd rather then tell other people about that in a gracious and patient way.
Why not spare people the journey and just avoid all conversations with people who are blissfully in that zone, in that reality?
Yeah. I mean, if they're blissfully in it, and
How do you approach that? Do you have your own way of dealing with that? Do you want to, when you have conversations with people who are still in that community, and you
yeah,
obviously you still know people who are, maybe your family?
yeah. In fact, I just got back from visiting
Is your
family.
family?
Yeah, yeah. Most of my family, I would say, they're pretty devout. Well, I mean, devout believers to some degree. You know, I mean, devout is a slippery term. You know, by whose standards are they devout, right? But yeah, and it's not.
Are they going
It's
to
not.
watch this?
I don't know, maybe, but you know, with some of them, it just doesn't come up, and it's not useful to bring it up because the bigger goal to me was kind of like my Presbyterian college minister sort of projected was that, look, no, if people come to Jesus, fine. If they don't, that's fine too. Just go love people. Essentially,
Mm,
live out the command, love your neighbor as yourself, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You know, those things that Jesus taught, regardless of the result. You know, the command isn't to get the result. The command is to act that way and live in such a way.
right.
So trying to, you know, in that, I mean, I still like that idea because those ideas seem to fall more in line with Buddhism than a lot of Christians would give it credit for. And so going back home and I'll bring up the idea if the intent is to essentially, you know, treat them how I would want to be treated. So I'm not, you know, to bring up the idea to say, you know, you're a dummy or whatever. It's like, no, that's not the result of that is not what I want. It doesn't bring joy to try to live out that ideal by just saying, hey, you're a dummy. But if somebody's interested in the topic and wants to talk about it, then yeah, of course. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about.
Right.
And if one of their beliefs seems to be a stumbling block for them, and maybe something I've learned that I could pass on would be a relief from that stumbling block. Well, then yeah, if they're looking for that, then of course, you know, that's
Right.
that's a very human and loving thing, seemingly, to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very balanced, stable attitude to have toward it, and I certainly try to strive for that. But
Yeah.
then once in a while, my confrontational tendencies kick in, and I want to prod a little bit sometimes, and I have to
Yeah.
really tell myself, you know, just leave it alone. Why do you want to have this conversation? Then I answer to myself, because it's nothing else to do, and you know,
Yeah.
and
kind of
yeah. But I think that your way of looking at that is a very balanced, generous way of looking at it. And I think on the other side, for example, the professor you had before, who had that, basically said that is on the other side, sort of the same exact thing. You know, this is yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Basically, this is what I believe. I think it's true. I have reasons for thinking so. If you have questions about it, I'd like to talk about it with you. If you can't find meaning in your life and the things that I believe, you're curious about them,
Yeah.
and things that I know can help you. I'll give you some of those answers, and I can explain some of the things that I believe to you. If not, that's fine. That's on both sides, I think, probably the most balanced way of approaching it. And I think that is the way that's most likely to lead to a situation which I would like to have, where I don't want to rid the world of belief, where you have discourse, you have conversation, you have mutual respect, not only and across religions, no matter what the religions are, with some exceptions for specific ideologies that are, you know, maybe hate infused, but it would be nice if those conversations were more common, actually, and it was part of the public discourse, and there wasn't a stigma around not having the belief, right? Because
Yeah.
if you just walk around and say, I'm an atheist, there are negative stigmas attached to it. It's interesting how that happens. I think part of it is based around how people define that word. Part of it is around the idea that word exists and people choose to label themselves as that. Part of it is around the concept of labels, right? Because just having labels means that you're trying to put something in a neat little hole, because that's that mechanism that we have where we want to try to categorize things and move on. You know, I think that all of those things lead to it all leads to some it all leads to a lack of discourse, honest, genuine, kind discourse.
It's just you don't have discourse, you just have action, and usually that action is annihilation. So if you can have the sort of, you know, having the differences without the threat of annihilation, or, you know, losing your place in society, losing your place with others. Because you said, what did you say? Labels tend to do that because they're a convenient and efficient way to get across, and, you know, a convenient and efficient way to get across the idea that something is this and not the other.
Right.
But in a lot of Eastern ideas, which compel patience because you have to work through them.
Right.
They don't adhere to Aristotelian logic that A is not A.
Right.
It's that, well, A could also be not A. So, you know, you think about, you were talking about the label atheist. Well, if, you know, when I think of an atheist, I think of somebody who's a militant effuser of hate, and that there is no God, and you're an idiot if you think there is, and there's, you know, no love in that person but then the idea that the more gray idea is that, well, they might be an atheist, but look at how much they also look like a Christian, and how much love they show.
Right.
Like this atheist acts more like a Christian than a lot of Christians I know, and this Christian acts more like an atheist. So there's that, and those ideas are very gray, but they're very compelling because it tears down, it does something to how we take labels for granted, and how it compels us to slow down a bit and
it doesn't compel us to slow down. It compels us to speed up. Labels compel us to speed up.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I'm saying our culture celebrates labels. We're a label-laden society.
Yeah, and if I didn't say exactly what you just said, then I made a mistake. It was that's not what I meant. It's exactly what you said, that labels they make things fast and efficient.
Yeah.
Whereas, and that goes in that.
And it's comforting to use them.
Right.
They're great reinforcement structures.
And to not have a label compels patience and thought, because you have to work through it because it's inefficient, because the label isn't there.
I think that's. I kind of disagree with that.
Okay.
Because I think that there is a label which is other, and that I think that one of the driving forces in just the structure of at least our society, a Western culture, American culture especially, I guess I can't speak for everybody, is I like Diet Coke, not Diet Pepsi. And that tendency to build our identities around the labels we associate with is sort of like you have a bunch of little tiles that have words on them. You've got your own little pail here, and you're sort of putting things in, and you look around at all the other ones and what other people have, and you say, oh, you have that one. And, you know, it makes... But then when there isn't one, when there's a concept that appears, I think in certain cultures it would compel, well, wait a second, what is this? You know, and if we were in traditionally what is traditionally more Asian, but I don't necessarily think that's true in all of modern Asia, certainly. What was I saying? Yeah. So I think that tradition is there in Asian cultures to work through the gray area and to sort of swim around in it and be sort of Alan Watts-ish about it and just sort of take some LSD and go, I don't know, maybe it's this and maybe it's this and maybe it's this. I'm done, and not come to any strong conclusions, or maybe make a very strong conclusion and then just say the opposite thing right after it. Which is also great, because then it forces you to have that conflict, and that conflict does force it. But because it's like almost a habit pattern that we have to label, that we have an other label, and I think there's a tendency that we have to say, thing I don't know, explore. No, there's not enough label. It's an other. Just leave it alone and not explore it. I mean, unless there's something really fascinating and there's something on the other side of that other label that you're trying to get to. My interest would be to have an other label that's slightly transparent, and then there's something really interesting on the other side, and people are interested in what's on the other side of that, and so they're forced to explore. I think it's one of the reasons why I want to have this podcast, because I want to trick people into listening to things where we might suddenly divert into a conversation that people don't want to hear about. Yeah. Hopefully. Yeah. Yeah. So,
so what you just said, I set up the whole idea of labels and then the not having a label, but in a sense, the not having a label is a label. Is that kind of... That's
what I'm saying. It's kind of I mean by the other label. It's marked other. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And and then that's, it's the point where labels fail us, yet we need a label. We need something to describe the thing that fails us. So we're with a label, and so trying to get, it's just this, it's a weird phenomenon that Campbell talks about in the idea of the ineffable. What is it? Oh man, somebody said, I forgot who it was. They said, it might have been Meister Eckhart, I think. He said, the best, what is it? The first best thing, or the best thing is in itself is indescribable. And the second best is, second best is,
ask that airplane.
Yeah.
Ask the airplane. Maybe the exact quote is written on a banner flying behind that airplane.
Geico? The second best thing.
$2 margarita buckets at Sammy's.
The best things are indescribable. The second best things are I really want to look it up because it's really pertinent. Can I type it in and look it up?
Yeah, Google it.
All right.
Just Google it, man.
For your health.
For your health. For your Google.
Yeah.
Just type it into the websites. Open up Netscape 2.0. Open up Ask Jeeves. And click on the button that says keywords. And then search it in your Google websites.
Man,
that was so dumb. I might actually cut that out. I haven't cut anything out so far, but that was the dumbest thing I've ever said.
I totally missed it, but I'm going to fail on it. But I'm pretty sure it's Meister Eckhart. The best things are indescribable. The second best are, we can sense it, but then the third best, I don't know. But it just kind of speaks to that idea that once we define something, if we're looking for the best or the ultimate, the divine, that once we describe it, it's automatically not what we're after. It's a piece of what we're after, because when we describe it, we're saying that it is this and not the other stuff. But in actuality, it's this and all the other things at the same time, but we can't express it all at once.
That logic reminds me of the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Explain it.
The ontological argument goes, if existence is an attribute, just like omnipotence is an attribute and love is an attribute or whatever. If existence is an attribute, then God must exist, because if God is by definition that which none greater can be imagined, we can imagine a God that exists, and existence is an attribute. Therefore, God exists logically, because a God that didn't exist wouldn't be the greatest of all possible beings.
Yeah.
I think that's how it goes. From memory,
Yeah.
I might have flubbed the grammar on that first line, but it's an interesting one. And there was Bertrand Russell, the famed logician, mathematician. I believe he liked brackets very much. He was also an avid smoker, and he was walking along one day thinking about the ontological argument. He's a hardcore atheist, and but he was just thinking about the ontological argument, and he suddenly paused, and it clicked in his mind, because the logic of it internally works. And he tossed his cigarette tin up in the air, and he said, he caught it dramatically and said, he was alone. He described it later. "By Jove, the ontological argument is sound." And then he kept walking. This is so classic. It's such a classic thing to describe of yourself doing, which is interesting as well.
Yeah. And that quote is
well, you found it?
Something like that. I haven't, man. I can't even remember enough of it to search for it. Maybe correctly.
It's Mr. Eckhart. Well, what a crushing disappointment.
I could go through my Campbell library and try to find it, but it's it would take forever. But
we'll do a tag on video. We'll have right at the end of this, just do a little selfie video. Say, I found my candle. It'll be 2 a.m. And you can just do a little add-on. You can send it to me. I'm serious, actually. You can do that. If you find it, I'll just tag it onto the end.
I'll do it.
I'll insert it right here.
So that Campbell quote I was looking for was not actually by Meister Eckhart. It was from a guy named Heinrich Zimmer. And Heinrich Zimmer was one of Joseph Campbell's mentors, specifically as Joseph Campbell was getting into Indian culture and mythology in general. Zimmer was a major Indologist and just scholar of Indian stuff, religion and thought and whatnot. So anyway, the quote is, "The best things can't be told because they transcend thought. The second best are misunderstood because those are the thoughts that are supposed to refer to that which can't be thought about, and one gets stuck in the thoughts. The third best are what we talk about." That's it.
And we're back. That was good. Hell of a video.
It was pertinent to the conversation, right?
I like the hat you were wearing in the video.
Yeah.
You're bound. You have to wear a hat in the video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where am I going to get a hat? I never have it.
I don't know.
If only I could find a hat.
Hardly my problem.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we were talking about a couple days ago that I really wanted to make sure we got to in this conversation, which I think is related to our label discussion a little bit. The definitions that we use and how those definitions can actually create more problems in terms of having that mutually respectful dialogue with people who maybe don't share your point of view, even with people who do share your point of view. I think it's really hard to when a word is filled with connotation and doesn't. I mean, our understanding of words, and I have a little bit of authority in saying this because I've been teaching English to English learners for a very long time. And I can say for an absolute certainty that the words people think they know are much more subjective than we think they are, right? We think I understand this word, and it is the meaning is how I understand it, but that is in many cases not true. I think atheism is a kind of an extreme example of that. But my question is, if we were going to take that on as a project, if we were going to try to tackle that, how would we approach it? How would we even begin to get people on the same page when it comes to a landscape of words that can have a lot of different subjective, meanings and ways to be understood?
Yeah. One of, thinking about sort of outside of that, just the act of teaching the word itself or being in the classroom, talking about a word. Well, what about also the life outside of the classroom and everything that surrounds it? Because one of the utility of words seems to be that it makes things efficient, because we know what it means and we know what it doesn't mean. It just gets to exactly what we need for action in a very acute, short time. But, with the ramping up of, and one of the difficulties is trying to implant the idea that not everything is, we don't live we do, but we also don't have to live at such a threatening pace for grasping and understanding things completely now and in this instant. You have to have more time to
so you think now it's a bit more pointy than usual.
Yeah, it's pointy because we reinforce this feedback loop of a threat that if I don't get it now and exactly what it is, then then all is lost. But
that's a very good point. That's a very good point.
But that's not really the case.
The stakes feel higher. Yeah.
Yeah, and they are higher, but they're also not higher. I mean, there's still 24 hours in a day. The sun, Earth still revolves around the sun. That hasn't changed, and that's sort of a limiting factor of what we can actually, and even in a strictly physics way, to some degree, that's a limiting factor to what we can actually expect out of a lifetime. And how much, and imagine if we did have the time to look at a word and think of all the possible implications and actually, I'm going to be, when you're learning a new language and you think you know what the word means, but then you learn there's all this other implication and nuance to it. Well, You can understand that eventually. You just have to have time.
Right.
Why don't I have time? Well, I don't have time because I gotta go to work. I gotta work out. I gotta cook. I gotta do all these other things. And we keep layering necessity upon necessity on our plate. But how much of that is necessary and how much of it isn't necessary, and then extrapolate that out to how much of a threat are we actually under, and how much of a threat are we just creating for ourselves by the way we live, and then couching learning a language into that situation and trying to learn what a word means and what it doesn't mean and all the possibilities it could have. I mean, it's kind of, there's the idea of the method of teaching the word or the language, and then also, well, what reality does that part exist within? What kind of, thinking about your students, well, what are their lives like? How much time do they have to actually learn? How much can I get across in the time I have to teach them? All that kind of stuff. But going to that idea of patience, time, and not expecting out of something more than we can actually get. Does that?
Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious what you mean by, you said the stakes seem higher than they actually are.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious what in your mind you view as the high stakes and the illusion.
So remember when you came to visit, you came back to Seattle, and I think Mushroom was with you, and you hadn't been back in the States for a long time, and we were sitting in the hostel cafeteria, the cafe, talking, and you said something to the effect of, "Yeah, I'm back here, and it just seems like everybody's frantically rushing around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to get stuff done." But that was very alien to the way that you had been living, and what I inferred from that was that you had lived at a slower, less distressing pace. Like, not as though not every single action during your day was a life or death choice. Whereas when you were back in the States, it seemed like people did operate under that idea that, well, I've got to accomplish all this stuff. Or, it's a frantic.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Does that make?
But how? Yeah, I do. But how does that tie into the way we communicate with the words we have and how we?
Well, and so the idea of the illusion and reality. So the illusion is that, well, why do we act that way? Is it because the things, maybe we act so frantically because what we think we need and what we expect to get out of our day is not reasonable and not even real, and it's not even, in the end, if we can't achieve all those things, it's not actually going to be satisfying. But we act that way because that's sort of the lifestyle we're sold. We're, in our culture and what all the stimuli we have exposure to here in the States, we are continually reinforced with the idea that things are frantic, things are fast, things have to be done now. You only have so much time to do it. YOLO, FOMO, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the place you've been living, the media and the culture maybe didn't promote that idea that life has to be like that. So,
and I think in a certain aspect, right? Yeah, I get what you're saying. But there's plenty of that also in Asia, especially in education.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
To an extreme degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially in education.
Okay.
Parents have only one child, and all the hopes and dreams of the older generations are on the shoulders of that child, and they don't try to hide it from the child. They try to stack it up and then make comparisons to the neighbor's kids, and then say, and you can play when you're 18. Basically, you can play when you go to college, but you're going to spend the next, up until then, you're going to go to school from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. And then you're going to have, on the weekend and in the summer, you're going to have wall-to-wall classes, extracurricular classes. So that is pretty balls to the wall in that sense. But yeah.
So then, and that is, in a sense, and this will actually tie back into the going off the beaten path sort of strain we started earlier. So, we take and operate under those illusions as though that is the only possible, only right and optional existence, that there is nothing different. There is nothing else we can do, that is good, just, and right. That, that like in the States, that I keep up with the Joneses, that I get the college degree, I get the spouse, I get the house, I get the career, whatever. That's the sort of prescribed illusion we operate under, which in some cases here, like you witnessed, it causes this frantic running around with you like chicken with your head cut off.
Yeah.
So when somebody sees that or receives that call to adventure and they sort of break away from that, they look strange. It's, their actions are strange in the context of that illusion of things are this way and only this way. But then that one person is like, well, I kind of see it differently. I'm going to explore it. I'm going to explore this other way on my own and see what it's like. And it's perceived as weird by the sort of massively accepted myth, essentially.
Right. The myth of the status quo. The myth of the status quo.
Yeah. And so, and let's say that, you're prescribed to act this way on this side of the myth, but then there's this other myth that this person is following here. But in a sense, both of those things are true in the sense that they're actually occurring. But one is operating under this illusion and the other one's operating under this illusion. But which one is right? Which one is the real story? Well, it's almost like both of them are real.
They have to coexist because Well, go ahead. Oh, yeah, I was going to say you have one person who you can't have everybody going off the path, or then that's the path, and then you have to. There's sort of a Pareto principle of deviance, probably. You know, the 80-20 rule.
Okay. Yeah. And so, but you know, again, one is they're both realities in a sense, and they're both illusions. But then drawing it back to what you were talking about with the questioning why I said that it seems like we're in a dire situation, but we're actually not, or maybe that's an illusion. It's sort of, we choose which illusion we want to operate under. Kind of like you had said earlier, you know, people put on blinders and don't look at the sort of fuzzy stuff. They just, or they fill in the gaps of color rather than spending time to decipher it and figure it out. We're choosing to do that. We're choosing to operate under an incomplete myth, no matter what it is, no matter what story we choose to operate under. So then,
even if it's the hero myth, yeah.
And so thinking that, well, this myth of, you know, innovation, technology, education, wealth, and exploration is the only story that brings salvation. You know, okay, that's the story, that's the narrative, but this other one might also have some validity to it as well. And then we get back into that idea of, well, even in these pairs of opposites, it's kind of like the Christian that acts like an atheist and the atheist that acts like a Christian. So there's this gray that they're actually, like the ontological argument, parts, real and legitimate parts of a bigger whole.
Right.
And so we're choosing what we want to do all the time.
Well, it's like having if you I get that. That makes a lot of sense. It's sort of like a village as a microcosm. Mm-hmm. And most of the people do normal things like hunter-gatherer. You know, you go out and look for mushrooms, and you. Why are you laughing? Why are you laughing?
I don't know, because I was saying you said you got to look for mushrooms, and I said, well, you found one.
Oh,
you were the hunter-gatherer looking for a mushroom.
I was looking for squash, and I found mushrooms. But then there's a blip, a necessary blip, that acts as the guidepost and the person who carries the myths forward. The shaman, the mutant shaman.
Well, and biologically with evolution, mutations, right?
And mutations, you could put it that way too. But in the village analogy, it's the medicine man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's either chosen, or there are signs that point out who he is. But whatever the case, he is part of that whole as well. He's off the path and yet in a path, because he has historical precedents to follow, and he knows he's part of another myth. And he's also within the sort of Pareto distribution of being maybe not 80-20, but he is if it were all a bunch of medicine men in the village, it wouldn't work. There can only be maybe one or two, right? Because you have to have people doing normal stuff.
They support one another.
Right. But you have to have both of them, because if it's just the village, then who's carrying the software forward? Who is bringing the software from the past into the present? Who's telling stories about heroic deeds to inspire and maybe bring out the next generation of or inspire people to go out and hunt and not be afraid of the wild animals or whatever it is. So I think that's fascinating, and I you know, that whole concept of why is it necessary that the rarer things that pop out have to be rarer? And is that an illusion, or is that a real thing? And I you know, you were talking about the example of the chickens running around with their heads cut off, which is, I think, a pretty good analogy. But there are some people who work extremely hard, but maybe they're achieving 100 times more success. They're getting 100 times more things done than the chickens running around with their heads cut off, because they realize that the time put in working hard on something doesn't equate to impact, and that you could spend 5 minutes doing something that has the impact that hundreds of hours could have if you choose the right 5 minutes and you do the right thing within that 5 minutes. And it's weird how that sort of pattern pops out all over the place. And I think it pops out, it seems to kind of pop out with the hero's journey, because you need that person to do that. And maybe the mechanism for making it rare is the public shame of stepping out. Like, you step away, and that's one of the mechanisms that makes it not common, because if it's everyone's going, go be a hero, then maybe too many people do it. And then and then you have, you have your Logan Pauls, who
it waters down whatever
it is. And then exactly. And then you have, I think we have that to an extent now in America, because I think a lot of parents nurture the huge dream that people have when they're growing up. They want to be a singer, or they want to be a celebrity or something like that. And because that's nurtured, I think that's sort of a violation of the maybe. And I'm just kind of, I don't know what I'm talking about here, but it would be interesting if that were somehow a violation of the distribution that it should be. And then that's one of the reasons why the culture that we live in is sort of imbalanced, because we should have more normal people doing normal things, but maybe there are too many people who want to do, who want to be famous because there are too many heroes or something. I don't know. I'm just saying that's an interesting thing to think about. I'm not talking from any, I'm not talking from any sort of data or any thinking I've done on it that much before, but I think it's interesting to try to think about that distribution.
Can you hear that? Can you hear music or anything?
Barely.
Okay. It doesn't. Yeah. Is it fine? Is it okay?
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. So
we can wrap it up in a few anyway, I think.
Okay. In the documentary, from what I understand, I haven't seen it, but the review I read laid this out, was that it puts the life of Elvis Presley, sort of his rise and fall, and lays it over sort of the potential rise and fall of the United States. And it shows, as he rose in popularity and fame and all this stuff, and sort of his sort of erratic actions that came at the pinnacle of his career, how the trajectory of the United States is looking similar.
Very interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And so talking about how we esteem celebrity, and what's the actual value of it? How much of it do we actually need? And then it seems like that might be a pretty cool narrative illustration of that idea that you just postulated. So I don't know. I would like
to discuss it more. I think we still have a lot to explore. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to get a little bit more into death, but maybe we can talk about that a bit more. And maybe I want to talk a little bit more about Alan Watts too, I think.
So to touch on the death idea, I mean, sort of folding that back into running around like a chicken with your head cut off, or teaching kids because there's no time to teach and there's no time to get a nuance. Some of that speed comes from, that YOLO FOMO idea of, well, there's no time to do all these things. I'm afraid of death. I got to get all this stuff crammed in with death. I got to fight death and get away from it. But then if you look in the Eleusinian Greek mystery religions, or pick any Eastern, well, not any, but a lot of Eastern religions, there's this, or, animism, primitive religions, or primal peoples religions, all over the place. There was such a massive acquaintance and acceptance of death compared to what we experience now, that it was, it's going to happen. It's a part of life. And, living with that reality and knowledge that, you're going to die, and it's a part of life, then there's a way that can sort of mellow you out and have more realistic expectations of what you can more realistic expectations of what you're going to get at a time here.
And that might bring things into better balance.
It'll balance.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I think the series touched on that a bit too. Some of the myths, or some of the traditions rather, around death. They don't put death far. They don't push death farther away from the center. They bring death closer to the center. We push death farther to the center, or farther away from the center. We push death to the periphery, and we make death the maybe someday conquerable enemy. And I kind of do think like that in a way. I mean, I think that's an interesting conversation that's probably separate from this, but the way that we exactly. Yeah. Why does everyone hate that movie? I don't know. I don't get it. I love that movie. It's an amazing
lenses.
Yeah, that's such a good movie. I mean, just I think if there's a case to be made for really believing in God, it is probably that if you really believe it, and you really, really believe that there's something waiting on the other side, and it doesn't make you Kierkegaard's Knight of Infinite Resignation, but allows you to treasure life, but at the same time, when your time is up, say, well, now I'm moving on to the next thing. I have another journey ahead of me. If you're able to find that, that's, I think inherently good. And there might be bravery in the idea of having a balanced life and confronting death, knowing that there's probably just non-existent darkness on the other end of it. Not even that. There's probably something there too, and that I think that's another conversation. But I think that's where there's something to be said for belief systems. I don't think it's not enough. It's not enough, because ultimately it's probably self-deception. Well, it's a deception that people buy into, and I think probably Freud would say that's one of the reasons for it to exist, and he's kind of down on it for that reason, that people are not living a lie, but people are living in self-delusion, right? Because correct.
Well, I just read Civilization and Its Discontents. It's the first thing by Freud I've read. I got a couple other things to read, but yeah,
that's the basic. Is that the basic idea? Is it that death is our vehicle of escape from the reality? Or sorry, belief is our vehicle of escape from the reality that we're going to die and not exist, which is the most existentially frightening thing that you can. I mean, if you really think about it, death is a scary, scary thing. So you don't exist anymore. If you really dig into it, I think it's fundamentally frightening.
Yeah,
maybe I'm wrong. Yeah,
I can't remember exactly what Freud said. I'm not the person to ask, because I'm not as familiar with Freud.
Yeah, neither am I. I'm not an expert.
I mean, I'm sure he touched on that. In Civilization and Its Discontents, it's more about he does talk about the Eros and Thanatos principles as being, pairs of opposites that compel one another to action. So you've got love and then the death, and you've got the, some of the things, there's almost like we're bringing about our own destruction because we love it, or it's something I think that's one of kind of what you're saying about Freud. That does seem to be one of his ideas. I have a pretty loose grasp on Freud, so I'm not speaking with any authority. Yeah. I just a lot. He gets kind of poo-pooed, I think, for very good reason. But man, some of his ideas are very pertinent, even if he it's a good idea. Maybe he built off of it in a way that's not useful anymore, but still that idea. I mean, other people that are still considered sound and valuable have those same ideas. So Civilization and its Discontents was pretty excellent. A lot of the stuff in there was, you hear a lot of people saying the same stuff today, and they're not fools. So,
Yeah. So it's a dope book.
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's difficult too, because every sentence is so dense with
Yeah.
language that's self-referential, and then it references stuff in the back. So it was kind of difficult.
It's like reading Heidegger. Heidegger is the hardest thing I've ever read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like
I've
it's every sentence is a novel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned, so people in the past, they did have much more of a sense of life and death being the same thing, and they often were embodied in the same God. Like Kali, she's giving birth and also devouring what she gives birth to at the same time. And I think, like a lot of goddesses, well, not necessarily goddesses, but the idea of the moon, it embodied life and creativity and also death at the same time. Because it, like a snake, it sheds its skin, it brings on its skin and it sheds it into death, but it's still continually, it's a creative power, and it's also symbolic of death as well.
Right.
And that was that, these people were thinking about this. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned thinking about stuff that somebody might hear in Cosmos, and then they just wander about their day and start ruminating on it or mulling it over, and it totally changes the way they think. And
Yeah.
so a lot of these old stories with the death and life being intimately acquainted, and in fact the same power, that compelled a whole people group to think similarly and sort of have the same thoughts, and then sort of act in concert with one another based upon that acquaintance of life and death, and not dismissing one in spite of the other or clinging too hard to one or the other. And it'd be interesting to see if that sort of does mellow you out or make you more wise or capable.
I think it's, yeah, I mean, when I see people like Joseph Campbell who have explored the landscape in every possible sense, intellectually, spiritually, and are not bitter.
Yeah. Yes.
And they're not bitter, and they're satisfied, and they're facing death with grace, I guess you could say. I mean, he really genuinely seems cool with it. Probably not excited about it. Nobody's, I guess, excited about it. But to be able to face non-existence, also knowing that probably the thing on the other side of it is not a thing at all, and that it's just your atoms eventually disintegrate, and and eventually one of them ends up in a squirrel. Knowing that, and accepting it and being fine with it, I think is a great thing to strive for. So I'm not there at all. I understand when I was talking about belief before, I think it's a great ointment, but ultimately I don't have a lot of respect for it in that sense, because it isn't. I think that there's bravery in the Joseph Campbell, if he's genuine in his attitude toward it. There's a lot of bravery in that, and there is wisdom in that, and there is something that I respect deeply. I don't have a lot of respect for trying to hide behind something else, even if not intentionally, but hiding behind something that eases it. It's it's sort of like medicating. When you have a problem and you medicate to hide it. But if you confront it and overcome, and then come to a point of peace, that is very admirable. So I'm not in either one of those. I'm sort of in a middle place where I think death is very scary, and I fear the void, and I think it's a thing that is reasonably scary. I don't think it's crazy to be scared of it, because it's a scary concept. Just the concept is scary, existentially frightening. So I sort of have it for me, and I don't know about you. For me, I have sort of these two things I see on either side, and I like that there are examples of them, and I know it's kind of a thing that's possible, and I have sort of an aim, in a way. Maybe it's a spiritual aim, maybe it's an intellectual aim, or maybe it's something that just happens when you get old. I don't know.
Yeah, Campbell, he talks a lot about death because that's such a fundamental component to all these stories, and a lot of the like the Hindu track divided into 4 stages of life is built around escorting people eventually through the dark gate or the gate of death in a way that it doesn't break the rest of society. So and this the Christian myth does the same thing. It's in a sense it tells you, well, when your time is coming, when you're old and the body's failing, here's the story that helps you deal with that event in your life. And just every religion or myth or culture has that, and it's
right.
that preparatory aspect to the story and the narrative of that people group.
But I also think that, like we were saying earlier, the hill that you have to climb up to overcome that challenge is higher for us than it is for other cultures, because if you grow up in a culture where I think, and obviously I have no idea, I have no experience of it, but if you grow up in a culture where it's close to the center of your daily life, then it probably, even if there are no delusions as part of it, it probably is less of a hurdle.
Yeah.
But I think for at least our society, it's so distant.
Yeah.
That you either don't think about it or you think about it a lot, and thinking about it a lot it's so far away. It's such a scary concept, So
yeah. I think maybe so. When I lived on Capitol Hill in Seattle, everybody up there is within a max 20-year age gap. You've got essentially, I'll say 17 to 37-year-olds, and it's just this sort of youthful, and you don't see a lot of, or at least I didn't see a lot of children, and I didn't see a lot of elderly people or people with gray hair, even. It was all sort of every day you've got people around you that look like you that are experiencing the same thing as you, and you're only hearing the story about career and experience that you can have right now, and they're really exciting. They're really, exciting, stimulating experiences, and you don't have the acquaintance and the reminder of that. Yeah, you're going to be 70, 80, 90 years old one day, God willing, essentially. And that's, if you don't get acquainted with that truth until you are 50, 60, 70 years old, then there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be in that experience that you're not prepared for, you're not acquainted with, nobody has told you about, you haven't, and
maybe fuels a midlife crisis.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, there's so many lectures that on Spotify from Campbell, and he talks about exactly that. People, going through a midlife crisis and having to crack up, where all of a sudden these things we're trying to pull from our youth into our essentially old age, they don't work, they don't fit, and it causes these neuroses. It causes, it causes mom and dad, as he says, to act weird, instead of sort of essentially aging gracefully, and knowing that this is just how things go. And it's not weird that this is how things go. It's basically knowing what stage of life you're in and gracefully embracing that reality.
But you have to have a good model for that stage. And maybe our model for the stage isn't because we glorify youth and we have so much infrastructure for youth, but maybe the social infrastructure for certain age time periods in your life is not enough, not insufficient. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and Campbell would say, well, built into these myths, they had the mechanics to prepare people for these different stages of life. But then looking today, what's our myth? What's our identity? What's our story? What's our narrative? Ours now is that massive emphasis on youth, but is that then an adequate myth if we experience dissonance and aberrations that we don't like, because the myth we're adhering to is actually insufficient. It only emphasizes, it doesn't talk about the other part, like the other half of the spouse of life, which is death, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we could have a whole conversation. We could keep going.
Yeah, we gotta get.
All right. So next time we'll talk about the fountain.
Yeah.
Talk more about death, stages of life. Something else. Who knows? But we have to do another one.
Dude, I'm down.
I'm getting addicted.
Yeah. This is fun.
Yeah. It is fun. I'm gonna be in China for a do for like 2.5-3 weeks.
But I'm gonna be
and you're gonna be in Spain. Do they have internet in Spain?
I don't know.
I don't think so. I doubt it.
Yeah.
I highly doubt it. Well, let's hope they do.
But they do have knights that fight windmills, and they do have a lot of ham, cured meat from the stand.
Right.
I can shirk off the internet for the good cured meat.
For the good cured meat and tapas.
Yeah. Tapas.
Yeah.
2 to 3 euro bottles of wine. That'll be pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But no Baja Blast Mountain Dew.
I'm not going. Sorry. I didn't know that. I'm not going.
You mean you don't have Baja Blast? How much did I deposit? Nah.
Yeah.
Scrap it.
Keep it. Yeah.
You just keep it.
Keep deposit. Yeah. Or import the Baja Mountain Dew for people, and then I might show up.
I don't know, viewers, if you are watching this, Matthew's obsessed with Baja Blast Mountain Dew. And I'm not supposed to bring it up. He asked me not to, but right at the end, I thought I'd slip it in. Just see what happens.
The bag, and I don't have my cat catcher's mitt.